Thank you so much to Tracy for that wonderful introduction. Let's see if we can guess what we're going to be talking about today. So we are starting a new series this week, and we're going to be looking at the Bible character of Moses. He's a very famous Bible character. Probably everybody, even if this is your very first time to a church, has probably heard of the character of Moses before. And we're going to dig in a little bit to Moses and his life over the next few weeks. I get to introduce the topic because you may have noticed that our pastoral team are away. There is a pastor's retreat this weekend, and all the pastors are up at Haukwa having a little break. So we think of them and pray for them. All right. I have a question for you. Who's been following the U.S. presidential? Yes, some people here. Okay, so I'm not going to get into the politics of it at all because that's fraught with danger. But I do have a question for you. Before Kamala Harris took over as the Democratic nominee, what did you think about Joe Biden's age? A lot of people made that the issue. He's 81 years old. Can an 81-year-old really be expected to be president? Is that too old? Someone says yes, that's too old. What does anybody else think? Is 81 too old to be a president? Some people say no. Okay, all right. So that's interesting. So I did a little bit of research into ages. Our current Australian Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, he's 61. So he's 20 years younger than Biden. That's interesting. Our previous Prime Minister, ScoMo, when he became Prime Minister, he was 56. Australia's Prime Ministers have ranged in age at the time of first taking office from our youngest Prime Minister was 37 years old and our oldest Prime Minister was 67 years old. Our average age for a Prime Minister in this country is 52. Do you think that's about right, 52? I don't know. What's the right age for someone to be in charge? And the youngest one, that was interesting, 37, I thought. Our third Prime Minister, a guy by the name of Chris Watson. There's a trivia question for you in case anyone ever asks you who was Australia's youngest Prime Minister. Chris Watson, the third PM, was 37. Unfortunately, he was only Prime Minister for 4 months. It didn't work out so well for him. But, he gave it his best shot, I'm sure. Now, why am I talking about ages? Well, because Moses, as you may be aware, our sermon today is entitled Moses, the First 79 Years. Because Moses was actually only called by God to go back and rescue the Israelites and bring them out of Egypt when he was 80 years old. And 80 years old, to be that age when you are first called by God to go out and accomplish something, it seems quite old to me. Well, I tried to put it in perspective. Now, they did live a bit longer these days, so I've put it on a timeline here of when Moses was born, and I got the ratios out, and I went back to my primary school maths, and I worked out exactly what the ratio was. Moses died at 137. So if we're to say that the average age in Australia to live is 83, okay, then it's actually 58% of his life had passed by this point, which would put him at 46 years old in our day. Okay, so if you want to imagine that, if you want to equate him living to 137 with us living to 83, then Moses is 46 years old. Yes, so hang on. No, sorry, it's 48 years old. I've read the notes wrong here. 48 years old. So that's interesting, I thought. I don't know about you, but I'm going to hazard a guess that potentially most of us in this room are younger than 48. Maybe. I don't know. Maybe we're not. I don't know. But I started thinking about that as a way that God interacted with Moses and called him. One thing that strikes me here is age is not a limiting factor to God. God doesn't look at someone and say, right, you're the perfect age. If you look through Scripture, there are people that God calls all stages. People as a child, like if you think about Samuel, he's a little boy and God speaks to him when he's a tiny child. And you also have Timothy, who worked with Paul, who was called as a young man to come and serve. And then you have other people that God doesn't interact in their life until much, much later. And so I want to think about Moses at 79. Let's have a little look at this story, because we believe that Moses wrote the Pentateuch. The Pentateuch is the technical term for the first 5 books of the Bible. And we're going to turn to Exodus chapter 2, which is page 48 if you have one of the church Bibles in front of you. And we're going to have a look at the story. And what's interesting, I think, about the story is if Moses wrote this, then he's writing about himself. And it's interesting to look back on your life and think, how would you describe your life if you're writing it? And obviously he can't say and I. He's writing this in the third person. But, how would you describe it? Now, the children's story wonderfully illustrated the start of the story. I'll just start reading from the beginning of chapter 2. It says, "Now a man of the tribe of Levi married a Levite woman, and she became pregnant and gave birth to a son. When she saw that he was a fine child," or your version might say good looking or handsome or beautiful. That's interesting. A little tangent here. Moses is the only baby that's described in the Bible as a good looking baby. There you go. Fascinating fact for you. "She hid him for 3 months." Now that's also a fascinating idea for any of you with a newborn. Can you imagine hiding a newborn for 3 months? But that's not a tangent we'll go down today. "But when she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him, coated it with tar and pitch, placed the child in it, and put it among the reeds along the bank of the Nile. His sister stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. Then Pharaoh's daughter went down to the Nile to bathe, and her attendants were walking along the riverbank. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her female slaves to get it. She opened it and saw the baby. He was crying, and she felt sorry for him. 'This is one of the Hebrew babies,' she said. Then his sister asked Pharaoh's daughter, 'Shall I go and get one of the Hebrew women to nurse the baby for you?' 'Yes, go,' she answered. So the girl went and got the baby's mother. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, 'Take this baby and nurse him for me, and I will pay you.' So the woman took the baby and nursed him. And when the child grew older, she took him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses, saying, 'I drew him out of the water.'" It's an amazing start story to Moses' life. The fact that his mother is paid to bring him up. Like, imagine that. Now, it's not quite the same as like the government providing you with child benefit for having a child. This is, obviously there was no benefits back in those days. And these guys were all slaves. So the fact that she's given money by Pharaoh to bring up this baby is amazing. But this is not the end of the story. Here in chapter 2, we're looking at the first 79 years, remember, not the first 3 months. So let's carry on with verse 11. "One day, after Moses had grown up, he went out to where his own people were and watched them at their hard labor. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his own people. Looking this way and seeing no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. The next day he went out and saw 2 Hebrews fighting. He asked the one in the wrong, 'Why are you hitting your fellow Hebrew?' The man said, 'Who made you ruler and judge over us? Are you thinking of killing me as you killed the Egyptian?' Then Moses was afraid and thought, 'What I did must have become known.' When Pharaoh heard of this, he tried to kill Moses, but Moses fled from Pharaoh and went to live in Midian, where he sat down by a well. Now a priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came to draw water and fill the troughs to water their father's flock. Some shepherds came along and drove them away, but Moses got up and came to their rescue and watered their flock. When the girls returned to Reuel their father, he asked them, 'Why have you returned so early today?' They answered, 'An Egyptian rescued us from the shepherds. He even drew water for us and watered the flock.' 'Where is he?' Reuel asked his daughters. 'Why did you leave him? Invite him to have something to eat.' Moses agreed to stay with the man who gave his daughter Zipporah to Moses in marriage. Zipporah gave birth to a son. Moses named him Gershom, saying, I have become a foreigner in a foreign land. During that long period, the king of Egypt died. The Israelites groaned in their slavery and cried out, and their cry for help because of their slavery went up to God. God heard their groaning and remembered their covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So God looked on the Israelites and was concerned about them. This is Moses' story for the first 79 years. It's very interesting what Moses chooses to share about, because 79 years of your life is quite a long time. And what does he share with his life? He shares the fact that he goes and he kills an Egyptian. So, you know, the fact that he's a big and strong enough guy to take out a guard, like Moses is no little wimpy character. We can also figure that out because when he comes across the shepherds, when he gets to Midian, some shepherds come along and drive the daughters of the priest away, and he by himself, like single-handedly takes down the shepherds and rescues the girls. So he, at age 40, he's like, you know, he's probably pretty buff and strong. He's very capable. He's got all these skill sets. And yet then, for 40 years, he ends up as a shepherd here in the bulrushes. The story at the well, where he feeds the girls' sheep, does that remind you of anything? Has this happened before in Scripture? It's actually happened twice before in the book of Genesis. And Moses would have known these stories as he's grown up. First of all, you have Abraham's servant looking for a wife for Isaac. And he goes and he comes across the well, and he's sitting at the well, and it's the girl that comes and waters his flock in that instance. And then the second time it happens was Jacob watering Rachel's sheep when he arrived at Laban's house when he goes to look for his wife. And so there's this pattern of when someone goes on a journey in Scripture, they often meet the next people they're going to meet at a well, they water their sheep, and something happens. So Moses can see that that's sort of a pattern that's happening in Scripture, but then he gets stuck there. He gets stuck in Midian for 40 years. This guy who had all this promise, who had all this potential, who was trained both as an Israelite and an Egyptian, who had all the learning and the skills of the Egyptian court, and yet here he is as 40 years a shepherd in Midian. If Moses had died then, age 79, would he have been a failure? What would he thought of himself at this point? You know, we're going to look at Moses in a lot of detail in the next few weeks, and you're going to hear some amazing stories about Moses the hero, Moses the champion, Moses the guy who goes face to face with God, who has this amazing relationship with God. But Moses at 79, he's not this conquering hero at this point. Moses at 79 is a guy who had all this potential, and he failed. And he messed up, and he killed someone he shouldn't have killed, and then he had to run away. And for 40 years, he's been in the wilderness, basically in hiding, basically afraid to go back to Egypt because something bad will happen. And he had all this potential, and what's he achieved? He's achieved nothing. He's a shepherd. I think it's important that we remember Moses' origin story because I think all of us have been there in our lives sometimes. All of us have had times in our lives where we felt like, you know what, maybe God has called us for a purpose and a reason, but we haven't followed the plan. We haven't done what God had put on our hearts to do. Maybe when we were young and when we were a child, we had burning ambitions to change the world for God, to make a difference on the planet. And we look at where we are now, maybe we're middle-aged, maybe we're older, and we think, we wasted our lives. We didn't take those opportunities. We've turned the wrong way. We've settled in Midian. We've settled as a shepherd for 40 years looking after sheep. And I'd like us to look at this story and remember a couple of key things. Moses reminds us that age is just a number to God. God can always find an opportunity to use you, to reach into your life, to make a difference in your life, to turn you around from where you are and still allow you to make that difference for God in your life. You know, I keep referring to Moses' age here. However, I don't know if you noticed as we read Exodus chapter 2, there's no mention of Moses' age. Did you notice that? Did anyone see that? Now, I was puzzled as I read this because I had always known in my head that Moses was 40 when he left Egypt and Moses was 80 when he came back. But I kept going, well, where is it? Why is it not? And I thought, is it a version thing? So I went and did some research. Does anyone here know how we know Moses' age? Oh, well, then we'll all learn something together because I didn't know either. We actually know from Acts chapter 7. Okay, now that's not what I'm sure any of you were expecting unless you secretly knew and didn't say anything. And I'd like us to have a look at Acts chapter 7 because I think it adds a lot of color to this story. Remember that the version in Exodus chapter 2 is Moses telling his own story. So he's going to tell it with his own perspectives. But here in Acts chapter 7, you have Stephen being stoned. Now, just to remind you, because this is a very different part of the story. Here in Acts chapter 7, Jesus has ascended into heaven. The early church is taking off. And in Acts chapter 6, you'll see that they pick a whole bunch of deacons to be people who help with food distribution and to support the growing church so that the apostles can keep preaching. And Stephen is one of the people who is picked to be a deacon. And the Bible says that he's filled with the Holy Spirit and he's performing signs and wonders and he's this awesome guy. And so, of course, he upsets the authorities and the authorities arrest him. And it says here very clearly in Acts chapter 6, it says, verse 11, they secretly persuaded some men to say, we've heard Stephen speak blasphemous words against Moses and against God. So there's our first link with Moses. So they create this kangaroo court where they create false witnesses and they come down and chapter 7 verse 1, the high priest asked Stephen, are these charges true? And then Stephen gets his chance to speak out. And we're not going to read his whole sermon here, but he retells the story of the children of Israel from right at the beginning where Abraham is called, and then he takes us through Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and then Joseph and going down to Egypt. And then he brings up Moses. And remember, this is the accusation that Stephen has been saying bad things about Moses. And here he, what's the verse? Thank you. Verse 23. Yes, when Moses was 40 years old. So, yes, I was going to start from verse 20. At the time when Moses was born, he was no ordinary child. For 3 months he was cared by his family. And then you've got this detail there about Pharaoh's daughter. Verse 22 tells us Moses was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was powerful in speech and action, which is a really interesting point because as we're going to see in future weeks, Moses says he's not powerful in speech and action and he can't talk. But I don't want to take that away from a future sermon, but just hold that in the back of your head. Then, yes, in verse 23, it says, when Moses was 40 years old, he decided to visit his own people. Verse 25 is fascinating. Moses thought that his own people would realize that God was using him to rescue them. Now, that is an insight we don't get from reading the Exodus version, right? That Moses believed killing the Egyptian was God's. Moses believed that taking out this guy was what God wanted him to do. But then, of course, it all goes wrong. He runs away, as you can see from the passage. Verse 29, when Moses heard this, he fled to Midian, where he settled as a foreigner and had 2 sons. And then verse 30, after 40 years had passed. Now, we're not getting into the rest of that story because that's next week's sermon. I don't want us to look at the calling of Moses today, because we want to just look at Moses at 79. God has not come and called him yet, and he's sitting there just waiting, feeling like his story is over. I don't know if you've ever seen this meme here. Life, what I planned, and life, what happened. It's so funny because this is often my experience, right? We think, right, we'll go on a plan. This is what happens. But this was actually Stephen's point. If you read the whole of Acts chapter 7, Stephen's point to the church, to the Sanhedrin, is God gives us laws, we break them, we fail. Then God sends along another prophet to put us on the straight and narrow, and then we fail and we kill that prophet. And then God rescues us again, and then we sin, and then so we're off into Babylon. And then God brings us back out of Babylon and restores us, and then we fail. And so this is the point of Stephen's sermon here. But it's the story of the Jews. It's not just the story of the Jews. It's also the story of Moses. And it's also the story of us. All of us have moments where we're on track, where everything's going good, where we're heading in the right direction, where we're on fire for Christ, and then bang, suddenly we're metaphorically Midian shepherd, wasting our life for 40 years. We've all been there. It's Stephen's point of his sermon in Acts chapter 7. Moses had a very long wait there in the wilderness, 40 years of waiting until God came and called him. Sometimes we don't understand why we wait, what's going on. All of us have lived in this waiting point where we're not sure where we're going and how it's going to work. And actually, as I was finishing putting this sermon together, a friend of mine sent me a poem which fits in exactly with this theme, and I wanted to read this poem to you. It's called Wait. It's too long to fit on the screen, so I have just included a QR code, because if you like it, you can snap the QR code and then you can have a copy of it. Wait by Russell Kelfer. Desperately, helplessly, longingly I cried. Quietly, patiently, lovingly he replied. I pleaded and I wept for a clue to my fate, and the master so gently said, "Child, you must wait." Wait? You say wait? My indignant reply. Lord, I need answers. I need to know why. Is your hand shortened, or have you not heard? By faith I have asked, and I'm claiming your word. My future and all to which I can relate hangs in the balance, and you tell me to wait? I need a yes, a go-ahead sign, or even a no to which I can resign. And Lord, you have promised that if we believe, we need but ask, and we shall receive. So Lord, I'm asking, and this is my cry. I'm weary of asking, I need a reply. Then quietly, softly, I learnt of my fate, as the master replied once again, you must wait. So I slumped in my chair, defeated and taught, and grumbled to God, so I'm waiting for what? He seemed then to kneel, and his eyes met with mine, and he tenderly said, I could give you a sign. I could shake the heavens and darken the sun, raise the dead, cause the mountains to run. All you see I could give, and pleased you would be. You would have what you want, but you wouldn't know me. You'd not know the depth of my love for each saint. You'd not know the power that I give to the faint. You'd not learn to see through clouds of despair. You'd not learn to trust just by knowing I'm there. You'd not know the joy of resting in me when darkness and silence was all you could see. You would never experience that fullness of love as the peace of my spirit descends like a dove. You would know that I give and I save for a start, but you would not know the depth of the beat of my heart, the glow of my comfort late in the night, the faith that I give when you walk without sight, the depth that's beyond getting just what you ask from an infinite God who makes what you have last. And you never would know, should your pain quickly flee, what it means that My grace is sufficient for thee. Yes, your dreams for that loved one overnight could come true, but the loss if you lost what I'm doing in you. So be silent, my child, and in time you will see that the greatest of gifts is to get to know me. And though oft may my answers seem terribly late, my most precious answer of all is still, wait. I think that that's possibly reflects how God has worked in Moses' life up to this point. God has worked in Moses' life for these 40 years of waiting, while he's just acted as a shepherd in Midian, waiting for maybe God has no plans for him. If you're there in the waiting period right now, if you're there with Moses as a metaphorical shepherd in the wilderness, feeling like, maybe God had a plan, but it hasn't panned out, I've got a couple of promises for you. First of all, I came across this lovely text this week, and Micah 7 verse 8. It says, "Do not gloat over me, my enemy. Though I have fallen, I will rise. Though I sit in darkness, the Lord will be my light." I thought that was a beautiful promise there. Though I sit in darkness, the Lord will be my light. And I think that's an important place for us to finish as we look at the story of Moses. Because actually, if we look at Exodus chapter 2, there is no mention of God in the chapter until we get to the very last two verses. Here comes God. And it's really important because God is the difference in Moses' life. God is the difference between the shepherd who's just sitting there in Midian and turning Moses into the man that we know he'll become because we've heard this story before. But now in this waiting point, Moses doesn't know that. He doesn't know that he's about to go and work signs and wonders and become a hero for God. In this moment here, he's the failure. He's sitting there as the shepherd. And if we look at that very last verse in Exodus chapter 2, verse 25, it's a fascinating verse. Actually, they massacre the translations of it because in the Bible that you've got on your seats, it says, "So God looked on the Israelites and was concerned about them." Actually, there's just two verbs here. It says in the original Hebrew, it says, "And God saw and God knew." God saw the Israelites and God knew. And this verb to know, which is translated here, was concerned about them. It's the standard verb to know. It's not a special verb that means something extra special or abnormal. It's just God saw and God knew. It's the knowledge that God has all the way through. And it contrasts with Exodus chapter 1 verse 8. We didn't look at Exodus chapter 1 because it doesn't mention Moses at all, and we're only looking at Moses. But Exodus chapter 1 tells this story of the babies being killed. And here you have in verse 8, the king who doesn't know Joseph. And so he changes his mind. He doesn't know. And it's contrasted there with this verb yada in Hebrew. There was a new king who did not know Joseph. And then you get to the end of chapter 2, but God knows. And you've got this contrast of the king doesn't know, but God knows. God knows your life too. God knows the ups and the downs. He knows where you are on that meme of swirly around and around. He knows if you're on track or if you're falling. He knows if you're in a high or in a low. And my message for you today is simple. It's never too late for God. God is the God of second chances. God is always available to turn your life around, set you on a rock and have another go. And God knows. God knows where you're at. God sees your pain like he saw the Israelites. And God has promised to be with you as he was with Moses too. Thank you.